And today we have something interesting that will be of interest to you. And we are going to be exploring the biographies of the Obama brothers to see how they're instructive in highlighting how different experiences shape individual trajectories in life, particularly within the context of Black masculinity and global power politics. So, in this lecture, I'm going to be sharing with you something that I've been researching of late, which is the biographies of the Obama brothers and how much they are revealing about several things that are unnoticeable when you don't take a lot of you don't pay a lot of attention. So the title here is how the biographies of the Obama brothers complicate blackness, and you're gonna see why we talk about this. And the first thing you want to know is what we will be covering, which is to explore the complexities of black manhood through the diverse narratives of the Obama brothers. The family's diversity, particularly that it is multi-ethnic, multinational, multiracial also, offers a unique perspective on how we can understand Blackness and complicate it even further. Their stories transcend borders, contributing to understanding of shared experiences worldwide and solidarity movement that are important in how we think about the relations between more established Black communities in America and in the diaspora and new immigrants that are coming in, especially from the 1960s. So now one of the things we want to do is to dive into their autobiographies to uncover the impact of some of the life experiences that I've shared and how that shaped their identities. One of the things I want to talk about first is to realize that this is a skeletal analysis and it's restricted by the premise of this conversation that we are having. And if we had more time, we'll have a much more elaborate discussion and dive into their autobiographies. So I'm limited by time scope. One, we want to start with introducing the individual who makes them brothers, though, so their father. So a little bit background for those who might not know, he belonged to Luo people, an indigenous community in Western Kenya surrounding the Lake Victoria region. So that's the area at the border with Tanzania and Uganda. Right at the dawn of the 1960s, as independent movements were taking hold in Africa, and kind of it was the idea of independence also needed a new educated African class that would take on the leadership and lead this country. And within that dynamic, a scholarship was arranged, mostly in coordination by people like Martin Luther King Jr., President J.F. Kennedy, and Tom Mboya, Kenyan foreign minister at the time, that brought in a lot of students from Africa to pursue higher education in the United States. And Barack Obama Sr. was one of them. He came to study at the University of Hawaii and later on went to study economics at the University at Harvard University. Right after he got, while a student, he got married and later on returned after his divorce with President Obama's mother, Ann Dunham. So the narrative that I'm placing here is revolving around the life history of this gentleman and how his doings or his persona and his identity then shapes how we think about the family in general going forward. So the first one that is the most um, common one is the story of Barack Obama. It's probably the most read biography of the four that I will mention, titled Dreams from My Father, Barack Obama. And this book, Obama's talked quite a bit about it, and some of his other works uh, that he wrote after this kind of references some aspects of this earlier book that uh, thrust him into the center of limelight. So one of the things that is interesting to take away from this talk is that from this book, is that he was named after his father, but he only spent 1 month or less with him as a conscious young man, like after he was a baby. Uh, Barack is the son of Anne Dunham, an American anthropologist with roots from Kansas, um, but grew up in Hawaii. And in the book, Obama has sort of like an idealized image about his father and his identity from stories told to him about his father's background by his white grandfathers. And in this, as he grew older, he realized he started to complicate this narrative, and he went into this journey of discovery about himself that eventually takes him to Kenya in the 80s and again in the 90s. Um, there is an indication of deep favoritism that his father had for him, but also his absence in his life that we get feelers about from other biographies that will later tell us what was happening in this man's life. But really, Obama is honest about his admiration and also disadmiration of his father. So on one hand, it's fascinated by his figure, by this figure and the stories of his people and identity. But he's also mad at some point, conflicted about his absence, almost deeming it as a rejection of him. So um, Obama struggled with a black identity. He didn't know where he could find his true meaning about what blackness was, particularly because he was growing up in Hawaii, which is multicultural and multiracial, but certainly not predominantly black. And as he grew older, I started to gravitate toward finding what blackness meant, and that meant hanging out with the few black father figures that were present, that were friendly to his family, or who his family was friendly with. And he does find this when he moves to Chicago or later first to college in New York and at Harvard. And right after that, he has this consciousness of reading everything black and associating with the black culture in a way that then uh, presents him an identity that he had missed growing up. But Barack still carries the emotional wounds of living without his father, even though he has a lot to say about him. He's kind of reserved on how he depicts him, and sort of the book's focuses more on how he admires it. The title of the book is "Dreams for My Father." It's a continuation of his legacy, and we can think about this as the fulfillment of his father's ambition being realized when he is elected president later on, which his father is not, and actually his life is in disarray uh, by the mid 60s and early 70s. So here is a little quote about him. He says, "My identity might begin with the fact of my race, but it didn't, couldn't end there. At least that's what I chose to believe." And so here, how Obama angles his agency is one in which race is a factor in his life, but it's not consequential in his life. And he pursues this carefully crafted persona that is extremely ambitious and extremely careful at balancing his whiteness and blackness and his Kenyanness in a multicultural America that is coming to the scene, in that he comes into the scene uh, to utilize politically in the late 90s and early 2000s. So this is what one of the reviewers wrote about Obama's book in 2011. He says, it's an attempt to arrive at a state of functional blackness, which I found interesting, which moves away from question of racial authenticity and identity, but recognizes the narrative of Black literature. So when you read Dreams, what you see is this storytelling that's very emblematic of Black literature, but one which is in itself very unique because through Obama's narrative, we are able to connect these narratives about Kenyan experience of Blackness, an American experience of Blackness, the challenges of living with an absent father, and the challenges of being raised in a multiracial society with grandparents who might not be necessarily very aware of your lived experience as a black man in 1960s and 70s America. So then we move to the story of the second brother, who's called Mark Okoth de Sanjo, and Mark is roots is the his mother is Ruth DeSanto, who is an American Jew from Boston. Their meeting is kind of highlighted in Obama's book, but mostly in his book that we get a clear picture of what happened. Is this when Barack Obama Sr. moved into Harvard, he divorced Barack Obama's mother, and so studying life in Boston as an Harvard student, he meets Mark's mother, and she falls in love with him. She was deeply in love with him. So when Obama decides to leave Harvard as a master's student, or he after he graduated with a master's degree in economics and go back to Kenya to work for the Ministry of Finance, Mark's mom follows him. And that so Mark is born in Kenya, unlike Obama, who is born in Hawaii. And here he writes the story about living with his father and his other half sisters, Malik and the um, and Auma, the other sister. He also narrates about the struggles of his father in Kenya. So while Obama tells us about the fascination with his father's intellectual ability and persona and sex appeal, Mark reveals about his father's other sides, which are not necessarily glamorous, and his struggles in a Kenyan society that is emerging from British colonialism, but in which these new returnees with American degrees find it hard to navigate this space that has entrenched elites, mostly through ethnic dynamics that are a little more complex than they had imagined. So this pressures of finding a place in an independent Kenyan society makes Barack Obama violent, and he drinks a lot and he is hostile to his children, which makes Mark dislike him and has such a very negative view about Kenyan identity as a whole, and in some cases, even his black identity. So, but he is successful enough to go to Brown University in the United States, as well as Stanford and Emory. And he's himself a very good writer and a successful individual, just like his brother is intellectually at least. But this is what he says that I want to give him some voice here. He says that Black Mzungu, Caucasian in Swahili. I was black to whites, yet white to all blacks. With no middle ground, with no middle ground, unable to bond with my black brothers, I quickly adopted the culture of my white mother and her more polite Caucasian family. So here, Mark makes a choice. He decides while living in Kenya and growing up in upper middle class Kenyan society, decided that he was more fascinated by his white and Jewish heritage than he was with his Kenyan and Luo ethnic identity, understandable in many regards, but also problematic in others. So, the one of the biographers of the father, Sally Jacobs, writes about Mark. Like his siblings, Mark found himself propelled by his brother's inspiring success to re-examine the family history and to open doors he had long thought family closed behind him. So in Mark's trajectory in his life, at some point he abandons this family project. He has a very difficult meeting with his brother in which their dislike for each other in Nairobi, at the time he was a Brown University student, very palpable. They had intense dislike because Obama had a different view about his father, which Mark did not have. Mark adopted his stepdad's name and only retook his father's Barack Obama last name when his brother was making political success in the American space. I think as a senator or a presidential candidate, it's hard to imagine. But he's also uncomfortable or perhaps even jealous about his brother's success, but also proud on him, manifested by his fascination with his family story after learning about his brother's success in the political space in America as a senator and then as a presidential candidate and subsequently president, two times president. So the other brother I wanted to talk about was Malik Obama. I think everybody knows about this brother. He's kind of infamous for his dislike with his for his brother and his uh, fascination with Donald Trump in the last election cycle. But what's not known is that they were pretty close. Malik Obama is the firstborn son of Barack Obama Sr., and he has a complex relationship and history with both his half brother, the president, and his other brothers. He lived in the same household with Mark and suffered some of the same consequences of his father's frustration in the Kenyan finance ministry when he worked there. So his complex relationship with his father is one in which he sees himself kind of othered, and Obama Sr. thrust into the center, even though he was absent. Even though Barack Obama was as absent from Barack, the president, he walked around with his picture in his wallet and bragged about him all the time. And you can imagine Malik didn't like this because he was the first son, and he felt like his father almost racialized him and othered him, put him out of place. So even though he grew close with Barack, and when they were in United States, he also had a lot more jealousy for him as well. They had He was his best man at the wedding and told him about his family story, and we get to know about Malik's feelings from his two self-published books about first about him and second about their father. So for when you think about it in the form of black masculinity, you see this idea of power, envy, and cultural disconnect manifesting. Malik has different expectation about his brother and how his brother should perform his identity and his blackness. And Barack is born in America, upper middle class society with very American values, and uh, his views of the world and Malik's views of the world have such a big disconnect, and that's probably one of the primary causes of their rift. And as Malik starts being a political baggage for Barack Obama, especially in the second term, their relationship is further strained to the point that they don't get any contact. But in his book, um, titled "Big Bad Brother from Kenya," we get to see a lot more about the family history within the colonial framework and his father's and grandfather's fascination with European and Muslim society. So his book illustrates how the Obama family has always been fascinated with globalism, adopted Islam in a region that was not highly practiced. And later on, his father was not a practicing Muslim, mostly a nominal Muslim, but in other spaces a Christian. So he gets to tell us a little more about the family's history that these other books written by the two other brothers with American moms do not. So the last book I wanted to talk about is one called Homeland by the youngest brothers of the Obama brothers, called George Onyango Obama. And George has a different life history from the three brothers that we've talked about. His life is that he's born after his father had died from his father's fourth wife. So his father died in a car accident in 1982, and shortly after, George is born. And George, in his book, describes a significant shift from a privileged upbringing in Kenya's the western side of Nairobi into the ghetto, mostly in the east of the city. And he detailed the experiences in Nairobi's slums and imprisonment, highlighting feelings of being an outsider within a family with a great name. His story raises complex question because his mom uh, meets a French cook who's traveling in Kenya and falls in love with the mom after his father had died. And he is pretty much raised with his white stepdad who introduces him into a very Western style lifestyle. But then this French guy abandons his mom and his life deteriorates and he struggles with identity even in the Kenyan space, ultimately going to prison. At the time the president is elected, he becomes a big part of the media fascination, mostly right-wing media who tracks him down to make a political statement of Obama's inability to care for his brother. While the reality is that the situation was more complex than the media perceived, and there was not a lot of connection between the two brothers um, at the time, as a result of many other things that he goes into in the book in detail. Partly because he wasn't associated with the father's family, and he took a side to join his mother's family. So while his name tied him to that family, he wasn't really hanging out with them. So the Daily Mail described him as the president's slumdog's brother. So his book is more rich about the experiences, which is very unique for all of these biographies, from all of these biographies, about a lifestyle of the regular Kenyan people, mostly living below $2 a day, and the challenges that they experience that is different from the story of Barack in Hawaii, upper middle class family, from Mark, an upper middle class family in the rich neighborhoods in Nairobi, and from Malik, who, while struggles a little bit, was pretty much middle class and went to elite schools in Kenya and the United States as well. So these narratives of the Obama brothers are very instructive in how we think about experiences of family, experiences of Black trauma, and the understanding of structures that might be racialized but also might be familial, in the sense that they're rooted in the family's dynamics. So we cease to think about Blackness from traditional structures of power into how those structures of power influence how family dynamics also operate. So one of the questions we ask is, was it possible that each of these individuals, equally very smart, very capable, very well endowed in many regards, could each of them still be having a shot to be US president if their conditions were similar? Or why is Malik now president of Kenya while Barack is? We don't have an answer to that, but their biographies do tell us a little bit about that. What their biographies do tell us also is about the connection about the Kenyan experience of Blackness, one that is imbued with colonialism, and the American experience of Blackness, one which has a deep history of enslavement and Black othering, especially in the South. So those experiences are not similar, but they are also subjugation of people of color on racialized term. And a lot more scholarship is particularly aware of the experiences of in the Western space called the Middle Passage. Very few people are aware of how colonialism also othered and segregated Black people even within the continental African space. So then we have to think about identity, how multiracial identity operates within in American space and how it does operate in Kenya. From the story of Mark, we get to see a glimpse of that, and it can facilitate rejection. In the story of Barack Obama, we can see how individual can transcend or utilize multiracial identity for their benefit, or this complex family history as well. And in Malik, we can see how expectation can be ruptured by cultural expectations uh, or cultural views that might not be aligning with people, even those within your family structures or family cahoots or families. But mostly, I think they highlight the intergenerational effects of historical and social factors on individuals and families. And the beauty of these autobiographies is their how much detail they are and how much they tell us about families and similarities of families, families of presidents and families of regular people all struggle through the challenges highlighted in this, even though this is a very unique family that's for very multiracial, global, and multinational as well. Thank you guys and appreciate your time. Look forward to seeing you next time. Bye bye.